Religious violence isn't just a series of unfortunate accidents. It's not a handful of extremists gone rogue. It's not a misinterpretation of holy books or a deviation from spiritual principles. The violence tied to religion is embedded in its very structure. It's baked into the theology, the institutions, and the power dynamics that religion has always relied on to maintain control. When we look through history, from the Crusades to modern-day acts of terror, religion has been used as both a justification and a cover for unspeakable cruelty. It's not because people misunderstood their gods, it's because their gods were designed to be misunderstood in precisely this way. Vague commands, open-ended metaphors, divine mandates for obedience. These aren't spiritual accidents. They're functional tools. Tools for hierarchy, tools for domination, tools for war. Take the Crusades. Often romanticized as noble quests for faith, they were nothing more than military campaigns backed by papal authority to seize land and power. They were wars where people were slaughtered simply because they didn't pray to the right deity. Men, women, and children were burned, decapitated, or enslaved under banners bearing holy symbols. These weren't side effects of political ambition. Religion was the weapon of choice, sanctified in pulpits and scripture. Or consider the Inquisition, a multi-century campaign by the Catholic Church that tortured, mutilated, and executed anyone who deviated from orthodox teachings. People were burned alive for heresy, a word that essentially meant thinking differently. The idea wasn't to correct errors, it was to instill fear. Pain was a form of salvation. And the church didn't just approve of it, they institutionalized it, built prisons for it, created handbooks for it. In the Islamic world, religious violence hasn't been confined to isolated groups. From early conquests to modern militias, religious authority has justified mass killings, stonings, honor killings, and state-sanctioned executions. Apostasy laws, blasphemy laws. These aren't outdated relics. They're still enforced today, often in theocracies where civil law is indistinguishable from divine law. Religious texts across traditions repeatedly promote us versus them mentalities. The chosen and the damned, the believer and the infidel, the faithful and the cursed. This isn't metaphorical, it's tribalism written in sacred ink. And tribalism, when armed with divine legitimacy, doesn't just exclude others, it seeks to destroy them. Let's not pretend that violence always comes after faith. Often it is born with it. In ancient Israel, the Hebrew Bible recounts genocides committed under God's command. Entire cities annihilated, every man, woman, and child put to the sword, livestock included. These weren't metaphors for moral purity. These were instructions, detailed, systematic, unapologetic, and in the minds of those who believed them, morally justified. In India, religious riots between Hindus and Muslims have killed tens of thousands over the decades. Often sparked by rumors, religious sentiments flare into deadly mobs, torching homes and slaughtering families. And while the state may try to calm the flames, the original spark is almost always theological pride. The belief that one God must reign over another, that one truth must erase the rest. Religion doesn't just promote violence, it ritualizes it. Blood sacrifice, martyrdom, holy war, divine punishment. The language of violence is embedded in religious liturgy and ceremony. People kneel to symbols of torture, sing hymns about sacred suffering, build monuments to martyrdom. Even in peacetime, faith trains the mind to see cruelty as necessary, as beautiful, as redemptive. Modern terrorism has often been labeled as politically motivated, but when you trace it back, you almost always find divine permission stamped on it. Suicide bombers quote scripture. Militias frame their agendas as divine missions. They aren't just seeking revenge, they're following holy scripts. And their gods, conveniently, always want the same enemies dead. People sometimes say, religion doesn't kill people. People do. But that ignores the obvious. Religion arms people with purpose. It gives them a license to dehumanize. It tells them that killing isn't just allowed, it's sacred. That their victims aren't victims at all, but obstacles in the path of righteousness. Violence from religion isn't limited to swords and bombs. It takes quieter, more insidious forms: psychological torment, guilt-based manipulation, eternal damnation preached to children, shame weaponized against women, exclusion masked as moral purity. The trauma is often invisible, but it runs deep. When someone grows up believing they or their loved ones deserve eternal torture, that's not spiritual guidance, that's abuse dressed as devotion. During the 30 Years' War, Protestants and Catholics butchered each other across Europe, leaving entire regions depopulated. That wasn't a theological debate, that was institutional hatred powered by religious identity. Cities were sacked, bodies left rotting in the fields, all in the name of doctrinal superiority. The violence wasn't a betrayal of religion, it was its natural expression when power is threatened. In the Rwandan genocide, churches became slaughterhouses. Religious leaders participated in the killing. Scripture was weaponized to frame entire groups as evil. It wasn't political strategy alone, it was spiritual permission that turned neighbors into executioners. Even today, religious violence isn't gone, it's just rebranded. It's in laws that ban gay marriage, in courts that deny women reproductive rights, in schools that push creationism instead of science, in governments that equate criticism of religion with blasphemy and punish it like treason. And the harm isn't limited to violent acts. It's in the narratives that shape societies. Stories of divine punishment, wrathful gods, holy vengeance. They train generations to accept pain as deserved, to see suffering as purification. And that's a deeply dangerous mindset. Religious violence is so persistent because it doesn't have to justify itself. It claims divine authority. It bypasses logic. It doesn't argue. It commands. And when someone believes their God demands blood, there's no room for compromise. You can't negotiate with revelation. You can only obey it, or die resisting it. What makes religious violence particularly dangerous is how it sanctifies cruelty. It takes an otherwise immoral act and redefines it as heroic. The killer becomes a martyr. The torturer becomes a prophet. The mob becomes a congregation. When belief and brutality mix, there are no limits. No amount of suffering is too much. No question is allowed. No conscience permitted. This isn't just a chapter in history, it's a blueprint. It continues to shape societies today. From the Middle East to America's Bible Belt, from Southeast Asia to Africa, violence under the banner of faith persists not because it's misunderstood, but because it works. It commands loyalty, it silences dissent. It offers moral immunity to the worst impulses of power. If religious institutions were held to the same ethical standards we demand from each other, they wouldn't survive, because faith, when shielded from criticism, can justify anything, including murder, including torture, including the slow erosion of human rights. There is no moral high ground in believing something so strongly that you're willing to harm others for it. Conviction is not virtue when it comes at the cost of another person's life, freedom, or dignity. And yet, religion continues to insist otherwise. The history of religious violence is not a mistake, it's not a misunderstanding. It's a mirror held up to the true nature of belief without reason. When the imaginary is treated as absolute truth and disagreement becomes sin, violence isn't just possible. Until belief is separated from power, until dogma loses its grip on politics, and until sacred texts are treated as literature instead of law, this cycle will continue. It always has. And the silence around it, the reluctance to speak against it, isn't peace, it's complicity. Religious institutions have learned how to disguise their violence. In modern times, it's less about public executions and more about policy, less about swords, more about laws. They've adapted to the language of the age. Now the brutality is often bureaucratic, sanitized behind moral slogans. But the outcomes remain the same. Marginalized groups persecuted, dissenters punished, critical thought suppressed, and all of it is still defended by invoking divine will. Think about the psychological toll of growing up under doctrines that threaten eternal punishment for thought crimes. This isn't abstract. Millions of children are told they'll burn forever for doubting, questioning, or simply being born into the wrong religion. That kind of indoctrination doesn't produce virtue, it produces fear. It produces obedience, it destroys curiosity. And once someone's imagination has been colonized by fear, they become easier to control and easier to weaponize. And this fear has been passed down generationally. Entire communities live in mental prisons crafted by religious myths. It's a slow, quiet violence. It doesn't bleed, but it scars just the same. People internalize guilt not for what they've done, but for what they think, for being human, for wanting, for existing outside a script written by men who claim to speak for gods. Let's also not forget how often religion has enabled political violence. It doesn't always need to swing the sword, it just blesses the hand that does. It sits quietly beside tyrants, offering moral legitimacy in exchange for legal protection. Churches and mosques have stood alongside dictatorships, reassuring the public that obedience to the state is obedience to God, that to defy authority is to rebel against the divine. This alliance has killed more minds than any battlefield. History shows us over and over that the moment religion gets power, violence isn't an anomaly, it becomes inevitable. In Spain, the church empowered the state to root out Jews and Muslims through torture. In colonial Latin America, Catholic priests didn't just support conquest, they accompanied it, converting the indigenous at gunpoint, destroying their temples, erasing their languages, and justifying the whole project as salvation. In North America, missionaries went hand in hand with empire. Native children were stripped from their families, forced into Christian boarding schools, forbidden to speak their languages, beaten for resisting conversion. Generations lost their culture, their spirituality, their very sense of self. That wasn't a spiritual offering, that was cultural genocide disguised as faith. We need to stop treating these events as deviations from the ideals of religion. They are the consequence of them. When an ideology claims absolute truth and unquestionable authority, violence is the only way it can maintain order. You either submit or you are a threat, and threats must be erased. Even in relatively secular nations, you can still see the shadow of this thinking. Laws that deny women the right to control their bodies come straight from religious morality. Efforts to block science education or to deny climate change often come from religious ideologues who think divine will outweighs observable reality. And when reality is treated as negotiable, suffering becomes inevitable. The persistence of religious violence isn't surprising, it's predictable. The systems have remained intact. The language has evolved, but the purpose hasn't. Control, compliance, identity politics under divine terms. Religions often claim to be about love and peace. But if love means only loving those who follow the same book and peace means silencing those who don't, then those words have been emptied of meaning. Real peace doesn't require conversion. Real compassion doesn't demand obedience. But religious peace is often conditional. Believe or be excluded, worship or be punished, conform or face the consequences. And those consequences have always been cruel. Whether physical or psychological, the violence of religion is justified not by necessity, but by faith. It's not reasoned through, it's revealed, unchallenged, and eternal. And that's the danger. When people believe they are doing harm in the name of a higher good, there's no limit to how far they'll go. When morality is outsourced to a book, cruelty becomes automatic. We are taught to respect faith, But when faith becomes a shield against accountability, it stops being a virtue. It becomes a weapon. When belief exempts people from reason, violence is never far behind. The irony is that most of the people caught in the machinery of religious violence are sincere. They genuinely believe they're protecting truth, defending goodness, saving souls. But sincerity doesn't cancel out harm. A knife doesn't become harmless just because the person holding it thinks they're doing the right thing. And institutions know this. That's why they prioritize faith over thought, ritual over questioning, obedience over doubt. Throughout history, the people who resisted religious violence weren't the loudest believers. They were the doubters, the heretics, the rebels, the ones who chose compassion over doctrine, who asked questions when silence was safer, who walked away from the altar and toward reason. And they were almost always punished for it, burned, imprisoned, silenced, or erased. But they were also the first to see what religion works so hard to hide. That morality doesn't need gods, that compassion doesn't require commandments, that truth is bigger than tradition. Religious violence is not just about blood, it's about control. Control over thought, over behavior, over bodies, over identities, over futures. And the first step to ending that violence is to stop pretending it's the exception. It's not. It's the pattern. It's the system. The story of religious violence is the story of what happens when certainty replaces curiosity, when power hides behind holiness, and when obedience is valued more than empathy. It's time to tell the truth about this history, not to hate, not to punish, but to understand. Because only by seeing religion for what it has done, not what it claims to be, can we begin to imagine a future where belief no longer bleeds into brutality. And if we're honest, if we're willing to hold religion to the same standards we expect from any other system of power, we'll see that the most dangerous idea isn't that some people don't believe in God, it's that others are willing to kill for one. Religious violence has always been wrapped in righteous language. It rarely calls itself what it is. Instead, it speaks in parables. It hides behind banners of purity, sacrifice, and honor. It offers eternal rewards in exchange for temporary brutality. And perhaps that's the most chilling part. Not just the pain it causes, but the meaning it assigns to that pain. Martyrs are glorified. Victims are blamed. Violence becomes not only acceptable, but divine. We often hear that religion provides moral guidance. But if moral guidance involves stoning women for adultery, cutting off limbs for theft, or commanding death for apostasy, then what kind of morality are we really talking about? When ethical behavior is based on obedience to authority rather than empathy or understanding, it isn't morality, it's submission. A child doesn't learn kindness by being told they'll be punished forever if they're not. They learn it by seeing the effects of compassion, by feeling the value of fairness. Fear might produce obedience, but it never produces conscience. Even within the sacred texts, the most revered figures are often celebrated not for peace, but for conquest. Moses, who leads genocidal campaigns, Joshua, who topples cities in divinely sanctioned bloodshed, Muhammad, who waged war in the name of revelation. These aren't metaphors. These are written as real historical acts, blessed and immortalized. And the people who follow these texts, even if they reject literalism, still often refuse to condemn the underlying messages, because to question them is to question the foundation. And faith doesn't allow foundations to be questioned. This is why reform movements within religion almost always fail to address the root problem. They soften the tone, they reinterpret the passages, they claim that violence was contextual, that it doesn't apply anymore, but the core remains intact. The authority of the divine, the superiority of the doctrine, the righteousness of belief, those stay untouched. And as long as they do, the potential for violence will always be waiting beneath the surface. The real danger isn't in the radical fringe, it's in the quiet normalization of spiritual exceptionalism. When someone believes their religion is the only truth, it shapes how they view everyone else. And that subtle separation, that psychological divide, makes dehumanization easier. It doesn't always lead to war or murder. Sometimes it just leads to silence in the face of injustice. Sometimes it leads to looking away when others suffer. Sometimes it leads to policies that favor one group while slowly erasing another. The violence of religion doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers in the ears of parents who disown their children for loving the wrong people. It whispers in classrooms that deny evolution. It whispers in governments that deny equal rights. These aren't loud atrocities, but they are wounds just the same. Cuts that don't bleed on the surface, but run deep into identity, belonging, and dignity. Even the idea of eternal punishment is a form of ultimate violence. Infinite suffering for finite mistakes. Infinite torture for finite thoughts. No justice system in the world would dare propose such a thing. But in religion, it's not only accepted, it's preached to children. That's not spiritual discipline. That's psychological warfare. Some argue that religion has inspired great acts of beauty and charity. But inspiration can come from anywhere. Art, kindness, solidarity. They don't need gods to exist. And they shouldn't be used as excuses to ignore the damage caused by belief systems that sanctify harm. A system isn't good just because good people use it. What matters is what that system allows, what it protects, what it justifies. The history of religious violence teaches us something uncomfortable, that people are capable of horrific things when they believe they're doing it for the highest purpose, when they believe their God demands it, when they believe eternity is at stake. That kind of belief is immune to reason, indifferent to suffering, and relentless in its pursuit of ideological purity. And in today's world, where nuclear weapons can be guided by ancient myths, where legislation is written by those who think their God wrote the laws first, this history isn't just history, it's a warning. Because religious violence doesn't end with the Crusades or the Inquisitions. It evolves. It adapts. It finds new flags, new enemies, new technologies, but the root is always the same: unquestionable belief and the power to act on it. This is why critique matters. Not hatred, not bigotry. Critique. Honest, rational, unapologetic critique. The same way we critique politics, ideology, economics. Religion has long enjoyed a privileged immunity from scrutiny. That must end. Not because people shouldn't believe whatever they want, but because belief stops being private the moment it begins to justify public harm. We must be able to ask hard questions. Why do so many wars have religious roots? Why do religious institutions protect abusers instead of victims? Why does faith demand loyalty over inquiry? Why are dissenters so often silenced, exiled, or worse? These questions aren't attacks. They're essential. Because the answers reveal what religion really protects: not morality, not truth, but power. And if we care about building a world that values life, freedom, and empathy, then we have to stop romanticizing religion's role in history. We have to stop pretending that the violence was an accident or that it was justified by the times. We need to recognize it for what it was and still is: a deeply structured system that uses belief to excuse brutality. In the end, the most humane world will not be the one ruled by divine commandments, but the one shaped by mutual respect, reason, and empathy. Not because a book says so, not because a prophet said so, but because we've learned painfully and slowly that peace does not come from shared belief, it comes from shared humanity. That's not an easy truth, but it's the only one that moves us forward.